Hello, I'm Joseph Luzzi. I'm a professor of comparative literature at Bard College, and I'm very happy to be here with you today to speak about Edgar Allan Poe, one of the most recognizable names in all of American literature. Not only a recognizable name, but we can also say a kind of notorious name, as you see here as the kind of the screenshot, the title image that you're looking at. He's always been associated with the macabre, with the haunted, the perfect one day university Halloween author, because his stories are so much about the world of the ghosts, the world of spirits, the world of the haunted. And Poe's life itself was the subject of so much controversy, the subject of so much inquiry into, how he tested the norms of what was acceptable and what wasn't, how he himself was almost like a character in his own stories. And I think that that has been, on the one hand, a positive thing in the sense that, Poe has become an icon and one of the most recognizable names in all of American literature. But on the other hand, I think sometimes that detracts from the true multifaceted genius of Poe in his writing. He was one of the most, gifted and talented and memorable writers to come out of the 19th century. And I think it's a kind of disservice to his legacy to just think of him as, a writer of ghost stories, to just think of him as someone who writes about the supernatural, because there was so much more to him. Ironically enough, in his age, Poe was known as a kind of, brilliant literary critic. He was someone whose views and ideas on literature were extremely, prominent. So he's someone who has a kind of an ambiguous reception. On the one hand, he is famous, he is well known, iconic, as I see here. On the other hand, he can sometimes seem to be limited to, a world just of the supernatural, just of the haunted. So let's go a little deeper to who was the real Edgar Allan Poe. Who was the real Edgar Allan Poe? I think the first place we have to start is in this idea of, the myth of Poe, right? The forbidden love for, his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia Clem, that he actually eventually married, stayed married to her for 11 years. She died young and tragically. There was this sort of, and she becomes the sort of the symbol of how Poe was the great transgressor, how Poe respected no social norms, and how Poe, even retrospectively, many see this as a kind of crime. So, this is the kind of the image of Poe as the kind of enfant terrible, the naughty child of American literature. There's some truth to that. I mean, it's a fact. This relationship is a fact. This relationship, which inspired some of Poe's most haunting writing, this forbidden love, is undeniable. It's part of the historical record. At the same time, I think this somewhat divorces Poe from the prominence that he. It's hard to say that he enjoyed prominence while he was alive, because he was always sort of a fringe figure. But the quality of his writing sometimes gets lost in the shuffle over the pouring over the more lurid and unsettling details of his personal life. So let's try and balance a frank awareness of the problems in Poe's personal life, the transgressions, the things that make us, upset, even from today, at a perspective of 150 years, to the kind of reality of what Poe was all about as a writer. And I think one place we can start is to think about, Poe as an actual historical figure. He's so associated with the city of Baltimore, and he was someone who was He died in Baltimore under very mysterious circumstances that we just don't, we're still not sure. Was it alcohol related? There's speculation, was it suicide? There's all sorts of unanswered questions about Poe's untimely demise. He died in his 40s. He was born in the early 1800s. He died in the late 1840s. So, there's a sense that this life, which was very, very brief, was so chock full of dramatic events that it becomes hard to kind of sift out the reality from all the hyperbole when it comes to thinking about Poe. So Baltimore is kind of, but it wasn't just Baltimore. He lived in Philadelphia. He spent time in other northeastern cities, but I think Baltimore is the kind of the one that's associated most of all with Poe. And one of the reasons is, I think, the when we think of the legend of Poe, I mean, his death is such a fitting sort of dramatic end to the life. His life ends in this haze of uncertainty and drama and haunting detail. And this was the way that he lived. And how did he live? It really was a chaotic life by anyone's standard. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe, call it an inimitable life. That's a kind way to put it. A more maybe honest way would be to say chaotic, troubling, disturbing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here you see the University of Virginia, a very beautiful campus today, and it was back then in the 1800s when Poe was a student there. But typical of Poe, his parents were actors. His mother died when he was very young. His father abandoned the family, so he was essentially an orphan from around, I think, age 10 or so, and then he became sort of adopted by the Allan family and had a very, very tempestuous relationship with that family and its paterfamilias over the next few decades. There were, accusations by Poe that he wasn't being financially supported. There was, of course, from their end of it, Poe was drank a lot, he gambled, so it was kind of a vicious circle, as it were, of these two sides that were bound by familial, never formally adopted Poe, but basically became a ward of this family, and it led him on this sort of careening early career through these different places. The University of Virginia. Doesn't graduate. He breaks, the rules there against gambling and drinking. So doesn't graduate from Virginia. Was he the world's worst cadet at West Point? That's obviously a subjective question, but he didn't do well at West Point. He basically disliked the place so much that he purposely got himself, booted out. So he's dishonorably discharged from West Point. He'd already decided he was going to have a literary career. And he's one of the few people, this is interesting about Poe, he's one of the few people at that time to insist on earning a career exclusively as a writer. Now, any of you know today, that's hard today, okay? Very difficult to just earn your living as an author. Many authors, I would venture to say most authors, do something else. They teach, they have a day job, et cetera, and the writing supplements it. Some very lucky few are able to just write and earn their living on that. But Poe was one of these people that, was one of the first, arguably one of the first Americans to live by the pen alone. And that meant a lot of reviews. That meant a lot of, commissioned pieces. That's why, one of the reasons why he wrote short stories. That takes a lot less time, obviously, to write a short story than to write a novel. That's why he wrote literary essays. But what you're getting in this early Poe is the kind of remarkable versatility of Poe, to write essays, to write book reviews, and really, above all, and to write poetry. He started out, above all, as a poet. And you get the sense that Poe was a man with a very versatile pen. In Italian, you say la penna facile. an easy pen, which means he just kind of had the knack. He was a natural writer. I think of him as someone like, F. Scott Fitzgerald, another young author who died young and tragically in his 40, and alcohol had a lot to do with F. Scott Fitzgerald's demise. They're very different. They're very different figures. F. Scott Fitzgerald was, he wrote these sort of novels about gilded society. He's more obsessed with class, whereas Poe is much more obsessed with the spiritual world, the supernatural. But they did have quite a bit in common in that they were volatile figures. They were unbelievably talented, and they died sort of obscure. Fitzgerald's great success did not come till after his death, as with Poe. They were surrounded by literary titans, especially Fitzgerald with Hemingway. Poe, he came of age in the early 1800s, which is a sort of renaissance in American literature. You have the whole, you have writers like associated with Boston and Harvard, like Longfellow. You have Emerson, Thoreau. You have Hawthorne in the Northeast. And it's just an unbelievable Walt Whitman. Herman Melville. This just great flourishing. The prominent woman writer Margaret Fuller. There's a sense that American literature is finding itself in the early 1800s, and Poe is a part of that. We'll talk about the kind of movements that he's associated with, but again, he's one of the few at that time to insist on living by his pen alone, living by his pen alone. So may have not been the world's best cadet, that's for sure. Whether he was the world's worst, that's a question of conjecture, and I'm sure there's been other less than illustrious cadets in West Point history. I think actually, Ulysses S. Grant, if memory serves me correctly, was not the best cadet, but ended up being, a pretty prominent general. So you don't always have to graduate at the top of your class to go on to success. And Poe certainly didn't graduate at the top of any classes. In fact, he never graduated. So he finished neither the University of Virginia nor at West Point. But his career took off pretty quickly. He was very active in the literary scene in the 20s, 30s, and into his death, and we'll say 30s and 40s. So, I've discussed at some length Poe's rather erratic personal life. That extended into his literary relations. He had some friends, he had some supporters, no question. But he also had some enemies, and some serious enemies. His sort of most celebrated rival and literary foe, I couldn't resist saying Poe's foes for reasons you can imagine, kind of rolls off the tongue, was this guy called Rufus Griswold, whom you see pictured here. Now, Griswold, by this strange turn of events, actually became Poe's literary executor after his death, and sort of systematically set out to destroy his reputation. This is why a lot of our image of Poe has come down to us. Poe as this person who couldn't handle his personal life. Poe as someone who was consumed by drink. Poe as someone who was given over to, extreme and unacceptable behavior. A lot of that was true, no question. But, Griswold pushed that. He pushed that. He kind of made this the kind of, go-to association with Edgar Allan Poe. And so it's not just that these antagonisms that Poe experienced affected his life, it actually affected his death, and would end up shaping his reputation afterwards. So Poe's foes were it wasn't a small group. This was a guy who tended to elicit extreme reactions in people, and ended up making a lot of enemies, and sometimes the wrong enemies. So when we think of Poe's personal life, we can also think about it can detract, I think, from his literary insights, as we've been saying. And he was someone who pulled no punches. The figure whom you see here pictured is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. one of the most famous writers of his time. I know Longfellow quite well because he was, I think, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, American translator of Dante. His translation of Dante from the 1860s, I think, is still one of the very best in the English language, if not the best. It was a remarkable literary mind. He was a professor of Romance languages at Harvard. He was America's sort of one of its, if I would say, its best-selling poet. His books sold very well. And he was very, Longfellow's poetry went down easily, as they say. It was, learned and it was challenging enough, but it was meant to be accessible to most people. It wasn't as disturbing or as unsettling, certainly, as Poe's writing in poems like The Raven or Annabel Lee. So when Poe read Longfellow, he lambasted him, he attacked him. He said it was the heresy of the didactic, that Longfellow was too teachy and preachy a poet. We can translate that phrase, heresy of the didactic. But I think it's so interesting because in a way, it's this amazing example of how you have a figure like Longfellow, who's sort of like his good friend Dickens. They were very close. Um, the star of American literature, famous, best-selling, wealthy. And then you have Edgar Allan Poe, who's obscure, always struggling with money. If there was one constant in Poe's life, it was money problems. Insists on living by his writing alone. Longfellow had been a professor at Harvard, so he had a very plumb academic job. He actually gave it up because he wanted to devote himself to poetry. And he found the teaching too demanding. So he could do so. A, his book sold, and B, he married into a very wealthy family, his second wife. So there was this sense that they were at opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, posterity has done a reversal. Edgar Allan Poe is read widely today, celebrated throughout the world. He's one of the best known and most read of all 19th century American authors, whereas Longfellow is read not at all. When's the last time you've heard a poem by Longfellow discussed? It, it exists occasionally in academia. Someone will write on him. There'll be some dissertation work on him, perhaps mentioned in a class, but nothing like Edgar Allan Poe. And it's a kind of reminder. I hope to do a one-day university talk on this someday, is how a work stands the test of time. What becomes literature with a capital L over the decades, over the centuries. It's fascinating. You can never tell when a work is published whether it will be well received by posterity or not. It can be the best writer, best known writer, the best selling writer. Sometimes those best selling writers in their day, like Charles Dickens, go on to literary fame and celebrity. Sometimes those writers who are under the radar, ignored, like Jane Austen. I mean, Jane Austen, for the first decades of her life, her first book, Sense and Sensibility, in 1811, the title said Sense and Sensibility by a lady. A lady. We did a one-day university talk on this, so you know what I mean. She couldn't even put her name on the book because of the patriarchal strictures of the day. Jane Austen has gone on to be a mega bestseller. Pride and Prejudice alone has sold 20 million copies. It's part of a film franchise now. So you just don't know. And a book that's a bestseller in its age could disappear. Even writers that were once canonical. Who reads John Dryden anymore? Who reads Pietro Metastasio? Who reads Henry Wadsworth Longfellow? Very few. That's the irony and the pain. I think even more than irony, that's the pathos of literary history. And Edgar Allan Poe's life is an example of that. This was a man who was ignored, belittled, thought of as a kind of curiosity in his day, a kind of Charles Bukowski-esque figure, hard living, hard drinking, but not particularly famous. And then with the passage of time, he outstrips by far the person who was several rungs above him, that same writer whom he attacked for the heresy of the didactic. And perhaps Poe was right. Perhaps Longfellow's more middlebrow and accessible work, under the scrutiny of the historical passage of time, doesn't stand up as well as Poe's on the surface, bizarre, feverish writing, which, if we look real close, is actually great literature. So it's a really interesting thing. Criticism we have to take with a grain of salt. Critics sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. Voltaire called Shakespeare a drunken savage. Okay, he was obviously wrong. He called his tragedies farces. Shakespeare was almost indisputably the greatest writer in English literature. Voltaire couldn't accept that he broke all the rules. With time, people realized Shakespeare's genius. It's what I would say is this: it's often the rule breakers who become the greats, not the rule makers. The rule breakers, the Cervantes, the Jean-Jacques Rousseaus, the Jane Austens, et cetera, while the people upholding the rules of their age tend to be uh, okay, respected while they're alive, but then forgotten afterwards. So this is a fascinating case here. Poe on Longfellow. Was he an American romantic? I think so. And what does that word even mean? Romanticism was this movement that took European literature by storm right around the time Poe's born in the early 1800s. Here you see the famous figure of Caspar David Friedrich looking out over the mountains, the infinite. You have a sense in Romanticism right here of its key themes, tropes, and ideas. What do you see here? You see nature as a powerful force, the sublime, which is nature is both beautiful but also terrifying. You see the individual. You notice how he's sitting there, solitary fashion. You see the imagination. We just can imagine him looking over this landscape and thinking. So you see all of these things at work here. And but Romanticism is mostly associated, especially with England and Germany. Less so France. Romanticism comes later. Italy has a romantic movement, but it never really takes off the way it does in other countries. The United States has an actually interesting relationship to Romanticism because writers like Pope adopted a lot of its tenets. There was a kind of offshoot of American Romanticism, transcendentalism, which we associate with the likes of Emerson and Thoreau, this kind of celebration of nature, the inquiry into the full capacities of the human imagination. Very intimate relationship between Romanticism and transcendentalism, and Poe's work fits into that nicely. It's not just Romanticism with Poe. It's a little more complicated than that, and I'll discuss that. But just to give you a sense of what Romanticism was all about, it was all about paintings like this. This is Courbet's painting of this wild-haired young man. Romanticism is about the self, right? Nature, the imagination. In science, it was all about awe and wonder. And there's this term that we associate with Romanticism, genius loci, the spirit of place, how certain landscapes, like this beautiful mountaintop landscape here, has this elemental powers that sort of, almost like the magic of certain places. Whereas a sense of the ways in which the romantic movement is a good backdrop to Poe's writing, because you can see how a lot of his works fit into this. For example, think of this idea of science and awe and wonder. What do we think of when we think of that? Well, I always think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? Which is a classic work of Romanticism. Mary Shelley's Dr. Frankenstein creates this monster that rises up from the table, this 8-foot monster with yellow skin and incredible muscles, and terrifies. Dr. Frankenstein created it. And remember, it's not called Frankenstein. It was called the monster. The monster. It becomes Frankenstein with time. But originally it was Dr. Frankenstein who created it. And can't you imagine like Edgar Allan Poe writing stories like Frankenstein? I mean, that's exactly the kind of work that he did. Mary Shelley's book started out as a ghost story. She was telling stories to her husband Percy Bysshe and Byron in Switzerland, and it sort of snowballed into this remarkable novel about this inanimate object that comes to life and wreaks terror everywhere. Well, that's right out of a playbook out of Edgar Allan Poe, and that certainly has romantic inflections. But more than that, more than romanticism, you have to go back a little further in literary history to understand Poe. It's more the Gothic novel. The Gothic novel was from the 18th century. And the Gothic novel writers like Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, these were authors in England in the 18th century that wrote about castles and spirits and haunted homes and exactly the kind of imaginary that we get in Edgar Allan Poe. It's romanticism, but it goes deeper into the supernatural, the world of spirits, the world of the unknown, the supernatural. I think that that is kind of as important a backdrop to Edgar Allan Poe's writing, the Gothic, as Romanticism is. A famous story is right here. Here's the title page from The Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story, third edition. These were very popular by Horace Walpole. So this is kind of the strands of Poe. And this is all kind of build up to thinking about these 5 stories of Poe that I want to focus on today. But it's important to have this backdrop to him to understand what his writing is about. So if I gave you a study guide to Edgar Allan Poe, you always notice too, he always looks so gloomy and forbidding in his pictures, these actual photographs. They're called daguerreotypes, a lot of them, this early form of modern photography. He's not interested so much in the natural. That's what the Romantics were interested in, of nature. He's more interested in the supernatural. That's what the Gothic movement was interested in, Gothic literature. The idea of haunted lives is central to Poe, and I want to come back to that. And I put sort of a glib last one, going for Baroque instead of going for broke. What I mean by that is he's not a Baroque writer. Baroque was a movement in European aesthetics from the 17th century, very elaborate, hyperbolic, and sort of florid imagery and writing. Rococo, extravagant, highly wrought styles in painting. But there is a kind of Baroque quality with a small b in Poe. There's excess. The word I always think of Poe is feverish. He writes as though, Dostoevsky does this too, a brilliant Russian writer. He writes as though his life depends on it. There's a kind of intensity in the writing, a kind of feverish pitch, a heat that emanates from the prose that makes his sentence just come so much alive. The opposite of Longfellow. With Longfellow, we get this sense of calm, magisterial eloquence. With Poe, we get this feverish sense of, the writing is a matter of life or death. So that gives us its Baroque quality. The haunted quality, that's obvious to some of you, but I want you to really think about that word haunted. What does it mean to be haunted by something? Haunting is something that is outside of you that appears uncontrollably. You can be haunted by a memory. You can be haunted by an image. You can be haunted by an event. Sigmund Freud says famously that once something is formed in mental life, it can never be destroyed. And no matter how we try and repress it, he says if you cut open the human mind, it would look like ancient Rome, like stratifications of memory arranged in an asymmetrical, asynchronous way. Freud said the fascist buildings would rise up next to the Renaissance palaces in the human mind. And that's sort of a metaphor for understanding Poe's definition of the haunted. The things that you want to repress that you can't destroy, those things that you continually hear and see in your mind that you want desperately to go away, but they will not, to be haunted. it doesn't always have to be a supernatural or macabre thing to be haunted. Think of James Joyce's brilliant short story, The Dead, how the main female character, Greta Conroy, is at a party and she hears someone singing, and it reminds her of her young admirer, Michael Fury. And she's haunted by his voice, this young man who loved her and died tragically um, as a youth. And she's never gotten him out of her mind. She's haunted by his memory. That could be something out of Edgar Allan Poe. He would add a supernatural twist and make Fury come back from the dead one night to, awaken Greta from a deep slumber or something. Who knows? But the bottom line is that there's a sense in Poe of a lives being not in control of the things that come back to bother, disturb, distress, and haunt them. A world of chaos, a world without order is the world of Edgar Allan Poe. No story to me captures that more than I think one of his very, very greatest stories, The Fall of the House of Usher. Picking five of Poe's short stories and leaving out things like The Raven, it was very difficult. I focused on the short story for three reasons. One, I do believe that of all of Poe's many genre, poetry, literary criticism, his number one achievement was the short story. I think he's one of the greatest writers of the short story, not just in English literature, but in literature, period. I mean, think about it. How many writers other than Poe are associated principally with the short story? Chekhov comes to mind immediately. And there's a sense that beyond Chekhov, you'd have to look far to find someone as accomplished in the genre of the short story. O. Henry is another name that I think of. People whose shorts fiction is much better known than anything longer than they wrote. Well, Poe is in that group, no question. And The Fall of the House of Usher is such a masterfully created short story. It's about a friend who goes to visit someone he hasn't been in touch with in a while, who lives in basically the most haunted house you can ever imagine, and whose sister perishes temporarily and then sort of comes back from the dead. That's people prematurely entombed is a trope, a very powerful trope in Edgar Allan Poe. It's sort of it reminds me a lot of Wuthering Heights, which is a totally kindred spirit work to Edgar Allan Poe's writing. Wuthering Heights, this story of this doomed relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine, and then how their house on the moors is just permeated by these angry spirits. That's definitely the world of Edgar Allan Poe. And if I were to point out a few things to look for in The Fall of the House of Usher, the first thing I would say is right from the beginning, it gives you Edgar Allan Poe's style. Let's read here. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length I found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher. Now, if my students had submitted that as an essay, I would probably have said too many clauses, for an opening sentence. You might lose the reader, but Poe does not lose the reader. You can feel the arresting rhythm of this. How many commas in that sentence? 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a semicolon, five commas and a semicolon in one sentence. If we did what we call a syntactic analysis of that and sort of a grammatical analysis, your Grammarly program, the smoke would start coming out of it. Too much going on here, but not with Poe. Not with Poe. It's almost like the eerie rhythm. It's almost like you're entranced at the beginning of this story. You're in this blasted like landscape. You're this dreary landscape, and you're approaching this menacing house within view of the melancholic house of Usher. This is a wonderful example of how Poe uses syntax to match that's the grammar, to match his semantics, his meaning. Or another way of putting it, here, form and content are one. The form of the content, the how, and the what of the story are in perfect sync. And this is a story about what we could call the sublime. This is a classic trope of romanticism where it wasn't enough to be beautiful, something also had to invoke awe or even terror. When we read about the house on page 104 of my Penguin edition of The Fall of the House of Usher and Other Writings, you get a sense of how famous that story is. It's right in the title. We read, "The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty." Notice the linking of terror and beauty. To give you an example of visual instantiation of the sublime, please look at the paintings of Turner, uh, the British painter Turner, his stormy seas, his sunrises, his way in which the chaotic swirl of the brushstrokes mirror the kind of overwhelming machinations of nature. That is the sublime in visual form. And this is the sublime in literary form. And that what makes The House of Usher one of Poe's very greatest short stories, if not the greatest. The Mask of the Red Death, I think, is also a very, very interesting story and a very powerful story and a very famous story. And I think it's really relevant to us because it's a story about plague. And, those of us now who've been living through a pandemic, which thankfully hasn't become a plague, can understand this story in a visceral way, which maybe when it came out all those years ago, it wouldn't have resonated so much. But if we look at the very beginning of this story, The Mask of the Red Death, the Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its zeal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution, the scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease with the incidence of half an hour. Notice how much he packs into that sentence.
How long have the two of you been married?
Pustules, the red blood, and this all took place within a half hour. This violent, sudden death. This is the world of Poe. This is why I described him as a Baroque writer with a small b. Can't you feel the feverishness? If you put your hand on the page, it's almost like you can feel the heat of the page rising. This is a writer who writes, who leaves it all on the table. Leaves nothing out. And I think this sense of a world of suspended laws, a world on high alert, resonates with us who've all been through now the pandemic. This is a world of the plague, a world of disease everywhere. And as in our world, everyone reacts differently to it. One particularly arrogant individual decides that it doesn't, it's not going to touch him. So, he decides to throw Prince Prospero, an allusion, of course, to Shakespeare's Prospero, decides to hold a fancy ball and to just make sure that they keep the disease out while everyone's celebrating in this gruesome costume party. And yet the thing is, you can't escape death. You certainly can't escape the Red Death. So what happens is the Prince Prospero is chased down by this form that no one knows who it is. And it turns out And I read now. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mash which they handed with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. Untenanted by any tangible form. What does that mean? That means that this figure, there was no human in there. It was the Red Death. The presence of the Red Death had come like a thief in the night. And the story ends. And darkness and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Where does this fit in Poe? Here's where it fits in. In Edgar Allan Poe, the boundaries between the human world and the spiritual world are very porous. And just as in ancient literature, you should never challenge the gods. Think of the Bacchae, where Pentheus challenges Dionysus and is ripped to pieces by the Maenads as a result. So too in Poe's world, never challenge the awful dominion of the spiritual world, because you will go down. The Telltale Heart is a very famous story by Poe, and a very short story actually. And it's more of a like almost a sketch, and it's one of his most disturbing stories because we have qualities of sadism. You know, like what's it about? It's about a guy who takes the life of an older person and enjoys it. He says on page, you know, and the person had done nothing to him. He kills him and then he puts him under the floorboards, right? And he says, I know what the old man felt and pitied him, though I chuckled at heart. That's where Poe's disturbing. The sadistic quality of taking gleeful pleasure in the torture and destruction of another human. And this is an incredibly neurotic character. I have told you that I am nervous. I smiled gaily. I took wise precautions as I dismembered the corpse. Ouch. So we have a sociopathic figure who is not just neurotic, but extremely, extremely unwell. Okay. And yet the story ends with we hears the heart beating through the board, that tick tick sound. It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such as a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. Oh God, what could I do? And I felt that I must scream or die. Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is story mean? It's so hard to say. I often think that what this story suggests or implies is that as dark as Poe's world is, there's a kind of poetic justice sometimes in a story. Prince Prospero gets it in the end from Red Death, even though he tried to cheat death in the plague. Here, the villain of the Telltale Heart is unmasked by his own doing. And in the fall of the House of Usher, which is such a diseased home, finally falls at the end. So all these things are a strange version of poetic justice. Now, the Purloined Letter is one of my favorite. It's actually not as well known as the other ones. I've always been captivated by this story for decades. And this is a story about, it's more cerebral. It's about Dupin, D-U-P-I-N, this famous, one of Poe's famous detective, like his Sherlock Holmes figures, like his Lupin figure, the French detective who solves cases by his cerebral intellect. And what is the case here? A letter has gone missing. It's very damaging. Against a person of high estate, and no one can figure out where it is in this minister's home, even though the police have ransacked it from top to bottom. And of course, Dupin is like, you're not looking in the right place. He says, and there's some foreshadowing in this story on page 282 of my edition, where he writes, this is a beautiful line. He says, perhaps the mystery is a little too plain, said Dupin. Oh, good heavens, who ever heard of such an idea? A little too self-evident. sometimes Occam's razor, the simplest solution is the best one, and don't outsmart yourself. So, the police are tearing the apartment up and down, and Dupin knows that someone as smart as the minister is not going to hide it where he knows the police will find it. So, what does he do? He just hides it in plain sight, basically on the mantelpiece or someplace in open view and almost taunting the police to find it. And Dupin knows this and goes to his place and does find it, gets it out of the letter holder you see here in the image while there's a distraction outside his window. It's an amazing story. And it shows, I think, the genius of Poe, where at one point he says, the police are too rational about this. And Poe basically says to be a true genius, you have to be a mathematician and a poet. You have to have rational brilliance, but you have to have a little fantasia, a little imagination. And that makes this story so unforgettable. And the last short story I would say is I remember reading this in high school. So the Purloined Letter is one of my personal favorites. The Cask of Amontillado is one of the first Poe stories I read, and I found it very disturbing in high school. It's about a guy set in sort of Renaissance Italy who takes revenge on someone who's done him wrong, and it's like a cold, cold, rational vengeance. And that we'd see in this story, the way it's sort of the thousand injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best as I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. And so he lures Fortunato into into his lair, and he says, "You're going to try this great sherry." And we get some foreshadowing of it on page 313, where he says, a huge human foot door in a field azure, the foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel. Fangs embedded in the heel. This idea of viciously taking down a foe. And he brilliantly gives you a clue of this punishment with this Latin phrase untranslated, nemo me impune lacessit. No one can punish me with impunity. So you're going to get it. You're going to get it, Fortunato. And he gets it. He gets walled up at the end. This brutal, brutal punishment. For half a century, no mortal has disturbed this masonry that keeps Fortunato imprisoned. In pace resquiat. Rest in peace. Now, of course, Poe himself, one wonders, has he rested in peace? His life was so turbulent. His life was so full of ups and downs. Peace was always incredibly elusive. And his reputation has been such a divided one. But one thing is sure, whatever trials and tribulations Poe experienced in his life, because of short stories like The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of the Red Death, The Telltale Heart, The Purloined Letter, and The Cask of Amontillado, he has entered that rarefied realm of literature with a capital L, and now his legacy is as one of the greatest writers of the 19th century. Thank you so much. I look forward very much to your questions and our conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our question and answer session on Edgar Allan Poe for One Day University. I'm Joseph Luzzi, and Professor of Comparative Literature from Bard College. I'm thrilled to be here. It's one of these talks. Every once in a while, you'll give a talk that takes you down some unexpected byways. And this particular talk on Edgar Allan Poe is fascinating because it just reminded me of what a rich literary milieu Poe was part of. In a way, he was the outsider. He was sort of always on his own, but he's a sort of rough contemporary of figures like Whitman, Longfellow, Emerson, Thoreau. So much is happening in American literature, and Poe is at the center of this storm. So I'm looking forward very much to your questions. The first question is an excellent one. It said, what tone or mindset should one take when reading a Poe story out loud? And I think this is a great question because it reminds us of Every author has different kind of expectations or different sort of things that they ask of the reader. I created this virtual book club, which brings together readers from all over the world and to explore some of the best contemporary bestsellers and beloved classics from F. Scott Fitzgerald to Toni Morrison and et cetera. And there's always that question of what is this sort of mindset that the reader needs to get into to understand Poe. I think with Poe, it's a very, actually quite simple mindset. On the one hand, remember, these are mystery stories. These are the supernatural, the macabre, the ghost stories, if you will. No, we're reading him at Halloween, okay, and that's not a coincidence. But on the other hand, remember something: Poe is a brilliant author. He's a master of literature. He's one of the great stylists of the 19th century. And that's why his stories had lasted. If Poe were merely a genre author, an author of, ghost stories and whatnot, he'd have a kind of curiosity appeal, but he wouldn't have lasted to become a classic author. I think the great analog for Poe is Mary Shelley in England, who wrote before Poe. She wrote, actually, they're roughly contemporaries. Mary Shelley was a little older, but she wrote Frankenstein in 1819. And that's a story right out of Edgar Allan Poe, the monster that becomes animated. But that's also a literary classic, that's filled with some extraordinary writing. So I would say the mindset for Poe is to think of yourselves as someone who is experiencing a writer of a certain style, the supernatural, the darker forces of human nature, but also remember that he's a great literary stylist. So you can surrender to the beauty and the ebb and flow of Poe's language, his metaphors, and his brilliant thematic content. Another one asked that they said that they read Longfellow, and even though Poe didn't like him, this person dived into Longfellow, and what can we take from Poe's relationship to his contemporaries? Another one of you said, for example, Van Gogh was harshly criticized and not successful in his time. Do I see similarities between Van Gogh and Poe? I do actually. And it reminds me of the difficulty. We talked about this in our talk. Literature is a very, very difficult species to identify in its time. You really need distance to understand. I wrote a book. I've spent the last 5 years writing a book about Sandro Botticelli, the great Italian painter. And we're actually going to have a premium course on Botticelli and these lost drawings that he did of Dante's Divine Comedy and what that meant for the Renaissance. We're going to be doing that in November, on November 15th at 7 p.m. I hope some of you will be able to attend. But one thing I learned about Botticelli, who's such a famous name, Primavera, The Birth of Venus, it's on coffee mugs, it's on keychains. Lady Gaga even wore a dress with it on, this image, is that for centuries, Botticelli was forgotten, neglected, occluded, just like Van Gogh. Botticelli had been famous in his time, and then he was forgotten. And now, you can't open up an art history book without seeing gorgeous full color reproductions of his work. So you think, how could this great artist like Sandro Botticelli have disappeared? Similar to Poe, like you read his work and you think, how could his contemporaries, how could Van Gogh's contemporaries not have recognized his genius? I think it has a lot to do with the following, and this is something that I've been thinking a lot about this year in my classes. I've noticed that certain authors and artists that are rule breakers run afoul of their contemporaries, okay, because they don't follow the rules. Think of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was called the drunken savage by Voltaire, the great French critic, because Shakespeare didn't follow the rules of neoclassical composition. He didn't follow the Aristotelian unities of time, place, and action. His plays are all over the map. How old is Hamlet? And sometimes he seems like he just graduated from college. Other times when he's looking at Yorick's skull, he's in his 30s. We just, there's this sort of unaccounted for details. Shakespeare was a rule breaker. Don Quixote, we're going to be doing a course on Don Quixote next year for One Day U. He broke all the rules. Along the way, he invented the modern novel. Shakespeare reinvented theater. So it's the Edgar Allan Poe. How could you classify his work at the time? You couldn't. It wasn't just simple ghost stories. It wasn't uh, traditional literature like Longfellow was writing. So these rule breakers are very hard to fit in a box. Same with Van Gogh. And it takes time to understand their achievement. It takes time. And that's why I think the similarities between these people who break the rules, but that are actually moving the needle of their respective medium, right? They're changing the medium that they work in. And that I think takes time to digest and time to make sense of. Why are so many poets like Poe and writers obsessed with death? And why is that such a big part of his work? I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that with Poe, it's not so much death. I think Poe is a writer of extremes. In this regard, he reminds me of Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, who, James Joyce described him as like having destroyed the Victorian novel because he broke all its decorum, he broke all its traditional rules. Poe does something similar. When you read his writing, he writes as if his life depends on it. But as I said in my talk, you can take the temperature of the page and it's like 108 degrees instead of 98.6. He's getting into feverish territory. And I think that his obsession with death, his obsession with the supernatural was a logical extension of his obsession with the extremes of life. And another way to look at it is like this. The novel at its best, or the short story form at its best, it explores areas that we can't fathom rationally. We don't rationally understand or know, what happens to the soul, if anything, when we die. That's a question that has obsessed religious thinkers, theologians, philosophers for centuries. Poe, as a poet, as a short story writer, interprets it in his own particular way through the lens of fiction. And so he reminds me of that. I mentioned Aristotle earlier in his rules for how to write a play, being, time, place, and action being very unified. He also said about literature, he said, literature is make believe. In history tells us what happens, literature gives us the make believe. It tells us what could have happened. It gives us imaginative universals. So, in the sort of analogies of literature, in the metaphors, we can find truths that rational inquiry can never reveal about things like death and other very, very difficult things. So, that's a wonderful question. One of you mentioned, and if I don't get to every one of your questions, it's just because there were too many to get to. One of you asked, what is it? um, what is it about Poe that makes him not just the kind of figure in American culture, but worldwide? And I'll tell you something. There's a famous French poet called Charles Baudelaire. He wrote Flowers of Evil, and he was obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe, as many French writers were. I think at one point he said, in the morning he prayed to God and Edgar Allan Poe, something like that. And it goes to show you that Poe's influence was not limited to American literature, but he's really an author who belongs to the world. And I think that's something important for us to think about as we continue to work through his legacy. As I said at the beginning, let's not think of Poe as just a kind of, one trick pony, just the author who wrote those really creepy. Let's not read them just once a year during Halloween. I think that Poe's, remarkable inventiveness, Poe's brilliance with language and prose, Poe's sort of stylistic flair makes him an author for all seasons. And your questions have sort of raised that question of why we read Poe today. And I mentioned my next One Day You event with you, which I hope to see you on Botticelli. And it's very similar. You know, I wrote this book called Botticelli's Secret, which I spent the last 5 years on. It's actually being published tomorrow, so I share that with you as you know, in anticipation of our event together. And what I learned writing that book on Botticelli was that, you know, when an author like Poe or a painter like Botticelli makes their work of art, yes, they make it for the present, but they're also thinking of posterity. And that is the kind of the audience that they just don't know what they're in for. Sometimes the bet pays off, like it did for Edgar Allan Poe, as it did for Botticelli. Sometimes it does not. And ultimately, we, the reader, or we, the viewer, decide. And that's why this event that we're having now, this conversation on Poe, is the ultimate proof that, you know, like Van Gogh's painting, like Botticelli's painting, he's alive in the present tense, even though he died some 150 years ago. Thank you so much for the chance to share these thoughts and ideas on a truly fascinating, not just writer,